So the way I want you to do this is to just raise your virtual hand using the Zoom interaction features. I'll then call for you to come off mute and then field your question to the stage. Okay, so we're going to take questions in groups of 3 or 4. So I'll ask about 3 or 4, if that's all right, Professor, to ask their questions, and then you can answer those in one go. So to start with, just see who has their hand up to ask a question. So if you use the Zoom interaction features, you can put up a virtual hand and then I'll let you know to call off mute. I'm not seeing anyone yet. There was a lot of talk in the chat. Nobody have a question? Okay. Got a PK, if you could come off mute, please.
Hello.
Hello.
You hear me? Yeah. Okay, I'll just ask it. Thank you so much, Professor, for that wonderful conversation. My understanding, and I know you said no pretext, Ekaite, but you know we're in the presence of a great man. So I have to take some time to thank the professor for his outlay, everything that he laid out. Like Ekaite said, even I, though familiar with Dudley Thompson, did not know about his work, his extensive work in constitutionalism. And also as well, what I'm going to ask you about, because I'm an educator, is about, you spoke about the promotion of epistemology steeped in the African tradition. And I wondered if you could expand a little bit on his philosophy in this area and on any practical steps he took to legitimize the, not simply knowledge of Africa, but African knowledge and African systems of knowledge acquisition. And, you know, as a Rhodes Scholar himself, steeped in the academy, I would also like, maybe as a secondary point, if you could just give your opinion about how much such intellectuals have done who are themselves beneficiaries of the system to promote indigenous systems of knowledge acquisition, indigenous philosophies of education, and also history as well, because history education is often central to that. I would really love to hear about Mr. Thompson's own ideas, but also about your ideas about the ability of such intellectuals to promote that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And then I'll just, also Amma has her hand up if you want to unmute yourself.
Hello, I echo Apike's sentiment, and I'm also kind of asking from the perspective from education. I am planning to open a Pan-African early years academy in Ghana, which is why I'm going to Ghana, and you know, sort of in the planning stages for that. And what I am kind of doing over the next couple of years while I finish my PhD thesis is kind of trying to develop a robust from early years, that's my background is early years, up until kind of all the way through education system. And that kind of asks that reparation question from that perspective in terms of how do we effectively advocate for reparations in a united way, from the perspective of what's needed from those in the diaspora, but also directly to the African nations, especially considering the fact that, you know, they were still paying our tax pounds for those in the UK were still going to old slave owners, so to speak, to compensate for their loss of resources, I guess.
Thank you, Amma.
Okay, so those are the 2 questions so far. So if we make a start with those.
Okay, well, those are two very good questions, and I think that's the heart of what I would like to take from Dudley Thompson's work as well. Apika, I think Apika asked a question about epistemology and the importance of epistemology in especially African epistemologies in Dudley Thompson's work. You know, I found that Dudley Thompson, you know, he was a headmaster when he was only 21 years old. You know, he had this sort of teaching ability, and it was based in large part not just on his legal knowledge, which is, you know, legal knowledge which is formalized legal knowledge which he got in the UK at Oxford University, but also on his lived experience in East Africa, between Kenya and Tanganyika. I think this lived experience was also a very big part of his epistemological understanding. Knowledge generated from Africa was very important for him. Also dissecting and deconstructing the Eurocentric views was very significant in many of the work that he has written and some of the things that he talked about. So I think he played an important role in trying to raise that notion of African epistemology, and also utilizing, taking advantage of the fact that he was a Rhodes Scholar, taking advantage of the fact that he had an education in Oxford that gave him the credibility then to talk about some of these things. And I think that's important. I remember Professor Ade being asked that question about his acceptance of the Rhodes Scholarship, and a lot of people might criticize you for accepting a Rhodes Scholarship, but he was able to utilize the credibility that comes with a Rhodes Scholarship, I guess you can say it that way, but utilize it to his own advantage in attacking what Rhodes stood for in terms of the racist and bigoted notions that he supported during his life. So one can utilize the knowledge that we gain from a Western education in order to be able to attack the fundamental problems that are associated with that kind of education. I really like what Amma is thinking about in terms of our own goal, in terms of setting up an educational system in which you can advocate for reparations and try to get a sort of a really good understanding of how to do that. I would encourage you to think very seriously about encouraging conversations through podcasts. I just started a new podcast called Black Talk. And if you go to blacktalk.ca, you'll probably see some of the major scholars that we have interviewed on that podcast. But I think there are ways in which we can sort of inject into the educational system ideas that are not normally supported by the westernized view of education. A lot of things that we don't learn from our Western education need to be sort of given to our students, and sometimes it's not always possible to do it through a sort of traditional curriculum, and therefore using podcasts, using social media, using other forms of disseminating that information might be important. So I would encourage you to do that. This idea of advocating for reparations, trying to find out what is it that people want is important. In the base of society, what is it that you want? Not what the authorities think you might need, but what is it that you really want as a form of recompense for the damage that was done to your people. I think that's important. So a conversation needs to be had at the local levels in order to be able to bring that about. So I encourage that conversation, and I encourage the utilization of African epistemologies in order to be able to arrive at your own position on what is it that we need as a people to overcome these legacies of slavery.
Okay, I'm off mute now. I can't see anyone else with their hand up at the moment. So I will just go to the there. I did see some earlier. So your thoughts on the silence, the aspect of the African Arabs. Question got here. What are some of the alternative models of statehood? So I think that's with regards to narratives that potentially could be used in Africa. If we start with those two, and I'll keep looking.
Can I tag on to that? Because
I might have missed the first question because I think you froze a little bit from from my system. You seem to freeze a little bit just now when you asked that question. So maybe you can repeat that question for me.
Oh, sure. I'll ask those two. Two people with their hands up as well. So the first question was on the aspect of the African Arab slave movement, on the recent disturbing reports of slavery and slave trade taking place in Libya. I just wanted to know your thoughts on that. Another question was, what are some of the alternative models of statehood in Africa? So 2 questions, and then I can see Winston. Winston?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Alfred.
Okay, if we go to, I think Professor Adebayo is here. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes. Oh.
Okay, guys, can you hear me? Because I think we've got some technical gremlins trying to sabotage us.
I can hear you very well, and I think I heard. I heard Winston. I heard Winston Quran, but I didn't hear the question. I'm not sure exactly what happened there.
All right, so you have the 2 questions in hand, and we also need the question from Winston. So Winston, if you're there and you can hear me, do you want to take yourself off mute?
Okay, should I go mute, off mute?
Yep, go off mute, please. Field your question to Prof. No? You've got tech gremlins as well?
Hello, I'm here, but I thought he was before me. Isn't he going to go before me?
Yeah. Yes, wait your turn, Professor Ade.
Exactly.
So Winston, are you with us, brother? No, okay. So perhaps when you get a stable connection, we can come back to your question. But Professor Ade, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Andy, and for our moderator for a really interesting session. I just wanted to kind of have more of Dudley Thompson within his own regional perspective. You know, he was a huge figure in terms of being a foreign minister of his country, and he was involved during the Cold War, very much so in the non-aligned movement, you know, in pushing a pro-Cuba perspective, and I'd like to hear a bit more about some of that geopolitics of the Cold War and his own quite instrumental role within that particular context. And then Dudley Thompson, as you said, was also a key figure in the Organization of African Unity's reparations in the 90s. Can you perhaps tell us what lessons can be learned for Africa and the Caribbean to develop a more viable and effective reparations movement for the contemporary context in which we live? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ali.
Okay, so that's 3 questions you have there. Lots of juicy question and lots to explore. So let's stop there for now. We'll go to the next round after you've answered those.
I was just wondering if, because I think Winston was just had to unmute his system in order to be able to ask his question. If he can try it one more time, and we can maybe add that question to the list.
Winston?
Okay, we'll get back to Winston later then. So yeah, some very good questions here. You know, I think we're kind of stuck in this notion of statehood that we've inherited from the Europeans. Whenever we think about in a nation state, we think about 1648, right? The Treaty of Westphalia. And the Treaty of Westphalia brought about an idea of a nation state that's so completely like a container, have a territory that you have to defend, a population that you have to take care of, and and sort of inside versus outside. That notion of Westphalian statehood, the Westphalian state, is no longer valid, I would argue. We still have them, and we still have to acknowledge that that states are still important. But increasingly we begin to see the influences of forces from outside the state penetrating the so-called impenetrable borders of the state. So there's a kind of an impervious nature now of the system, and I like to think in terms of an intermestic approach to this, where the lines that normally separate the external from the internal have become so blurry that we have to rethink our notions of governance. So instead of thinking about national models, nation-state models, I would like to think more in terms of governance models. How can we best govern society? And we may have to look at multi-level governance as a form of governance. We've seen it already in practice, where regional organizations have been created in certain regions to unify or to pool the sovereignty of individual nation states that acting on their own, they cannot really do a good job of protecting themselves or sustaining themselves economically. So you create a regional organization to do that. We have a UN system, international system at the global level that tries to tackle all the problems that cannot be addressed by individual states acting on their own. So my suggestion would be that we look at models of collaboration and cooperation and governance to find the best way to govern ourselves as peoples. And this throws everything that we know about national sovereign states out the window. But it's something that we have to think about. It's a very radical way of looking at it, but I think it's important to think about that as a means of a new model of statehood. Concerning the African and Arab notions, the fact that slavery still persists in Libya, for example. I mean, we've had examples of slavery within Libya as a state. It just shows that we haven't really gotten rid of slavery as an institution. There's still people wanting to have slaves for some reason. So we haven't yet dismissed and gotten rid of that notion. So this is something that the international community has to think very seriously about. Slavery has to be treated as one of those major crimes against humanity in the same way that we look at genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing. Slavery should be one of them. This should not happen in the 21st century. And any attempts to enslave people is another indication of our unwillingness to treat people as equals, to treat people as human beings. So I think at the base, we need to sort of examine this from an international perspective. Not just simply look at Libya as the odd man out or the odd case out, because there is slavery happening in many parts of the globe today as well. These questions were very well taken. I think the notion of Dudley as a regionalist. First of all, let me start with saying that, when Dudley got engaged in politics in Jamaica, he'd already had a pretty good history of engagement with politicians in East Africa. He was part of that movement that brought about decolonization in many parts of Africa. He was definitely, he had that lived experience of fighting on behalf of the African people to bring about liberation for African peoples. But when he came back to Jamaica, he was, of course, a very good friend of Michael Manley, who eventually became Prime Minister of Jamaica. And as I mentioned in my talk, In 1975, he was appointed as Foreign Minister of Jamaica. And this allowed him, I think, to address some issues of importance for the Caribbean as a region. For example, he traveled to Jamaica, from Jamaica, he traveled to Cuba with Michael Manley for a secret meeting with Fidel Castro. He was able to rally around the idea of supporting Cuba from the onslaught of the United States, and also supporting Cuba's armed liberation struggles in South Africa and in that South African region. He worked on behalf of the movement to get rid of apartheid in South Africa. He worked closely with members of the non-aligned movement to defend their right to be treated justly and fairly at the international level. So he already had that sort of broader international vision, and would work within international bodies in order to bring that about. He was a very strong advocate, as I mentioned before, of the new international economic order, because he felt if there was going to be any changes towards a Pan-Africanist society that's viable and sustainable, you're going to have changes in the international economic system. So he was a very strong advocate for the establishment of the new international economic order, and we know that this was not a very popular thing among Western countries, but it was certainly supported by him. He was a primary driver of the negotiations around bauxite and other minerals that third world countries had, aluminium and others. The fact that many of the riches of the third world countries were being siphoned off to the metropole was extremely significant for him. Foreign firms, for example, siphoned off much of Jamaica's natural resources to the metropole, and he saw this as being another element of colonization and imperialism that needed to be addressed. He played a major role in the creation of a new cartel system. You know, we always talk about the Organization for the Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, as being a cartel. But he wanted to see whether or not the Caribbean can actually create a cartel that's very similar to OPEC. So he was a very strong supporter of that as well. He served, and I mentioned this, but I think it's important to reemphasize the fact that Dudley Thompson was one of the Jamaican representatives at the United Nations Conference on the Law of the Sea. And of course, that was to me an important revolutionary conference in the sense that it gave countries, especially countries in the Caribbean and other maritime countries, the possibility of a blue economy that can help to bolster their own economies. The creation of a international seabed authority to deal with the clashes between countries over materials in the ocean seabed, I think it was important as well. And he played a major role in making sure that Jamaica became the headquarters of the International Seabed Authority, and it still is today. So I think Adam brings a very important point. He was a crucial player in the economic changes that were happening in the 70s and the 80s. And his politics was not limited just to Jamaica. He was a pan-Caribbeanist in a sense. He used his legal skills and knowledge to support cases in places like Barbados and Trinidad, in many Caribbean countries beyond Jamaica. So he was not just a narrow national nativist. He was also a believer in regionalism. He felt the Caribbean, in order to be an effective entity at a global level, ought to be unified regionally. So that's why he supported CARICOM's initiatives, CARIFTA, the whole notion of the ability for people to move around the Caribbean in search of jobs, the free movement of people, very much like the European Union was when it was created. So these were very important stages in his life. His affiliation with Bob Marley, and I know that the book the Pantheon, this book has taught a little bit about Bob Marley as well. But Bob Marley, the famous reggae superstar, had a relationship with Dudley Thompson, and I think that probably explains a lot about the man. But there was one incident which I didn't mention. I mentioned in my book, but I didn't mention in my talk, was the mistake that he made when he was minister responsible for national security. There were 5 young men who were supporters of the opposite party, Jamaica Labour Party, who were shot dead by at a military range in Green Bay in St. Catharines in Jamaica, and they were apparently shot by government soldiers. And 10 government soldiers were actually arrested eventually and faced charges for the murders of the what they call extrajudicial killings. And they were either charged with murder or attempts, conspiracy to commit murder. And one of the things that Dudley Thompson did, was very uncharacteristic of the man, is that he made a comment publicly that said that no angels died at Green Bay, which basically essentially got the Jamaican military off the hook, in a sense, by saying that these individuals that were killed were not angels. And I think he regretted that statement, and he apologized profusely over the rest of his political life for that statement. And I think it sort of tainted an otherwise stellar reputation that he had within Jamaica. One of the Jamaican scholars, Horace Campbell, who wrote about a sort of critical review of Thompson's life, he said that was an ill-advised comment that was made by Thompson that hurt his reputation. But at the end of the day, I think Campbell believed that this indiscretion should not overshadow the overall legacy of Dudley Thompson. I think his overall legacy remains intact, despite that one failing. I can mention about his accreditation to Ghana, for example. I know there's some people from Ghana here. His accreditation to Sierra Leone, his accreditation to the Cameroons and Namibia. One of the reasons why, as a Jamaican diplomat, he was able to just smoothly move into those positions of diplomatic activity with those African countries, was because of his lived experience in East Africa and his connections that he made while he was doing his job in Kenya and Tanganyika. He has cemented his place at the center of Pan-African movement, as far as I'm concerned, based on what I've done in terms of my research. And I think the vision that he had of a federation or confederation of Africa, one government for the whole of Africa, is still very much on the table, even although a lot of people say that this is a utopian vision. But his notion that there should be a federal government of Africa that would include the diaspora as a 6th district is an important contribution, at least to the thinking about how Pan-Africanism can actually proceed. So I hope I did justice to Ade's question and to the other questions as well, but thank you very much for asking them.
Okay, so see if we can go to Winston. Winston, do you want to unmute yourself?
Right. Am I on now?
Yes.
Yes, I can hear you now.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry about the little difficulties. I want to first of all compliment Professor Knight for a very fascinating dialogue here today and bringing out a lot of historical, legal, and diplomatic issues of the past that obviously has contemporary relevance. And I want to just go back to one of the questions that you, Mrs. Alfred, raised earlier about the international system and its ability to accommodate the thinking that emerges out of this assessment of the events of the past. And to the question of the international order, I think Professor Knight raised the issue that he thought perhaps looking at the international not legal, but justice system might be a more appropriate way of handling the legitimacy, the wider moral and political legitimacy of the issue. And I just wanted to raise, and then he subsequently seemed to have suggested a number of development type issues that can be raised as a means of compensation in that context. But even that, I believe, might create a lot of interpretation issues and a lot of issues that would lead one to ascribe guilt, etc., as much as guilt ought to be ascribed. But in the actual conduct of diplomatic relations, sometimes you have to go around that. So I was wondering what Dr. Knight may think about, instead of dealing with it in the context of an international justice system, but focusing really on a human justice system. And the human justice, the history of human justice, which of course goes back to some of the incidents in which reparations were used in the past, which was not really justice in a wider sense, but human justice in the narrower sense, focusing on the individuals who have suffered as a result, but not necessarily linking the compensation to the individuals, as you have rightly pointed out may not be realistic. So my question really is his comment on focusing on an international human justice system and therefore linking a development type response to it, to that instead of the wider justice system. And whether this is something worthy of consideration, given your own assessment.
Okay, thank you. Got a question from a PK as well, if you want to unmute yourself.
Thank you so much. Sorry, this is my second question, but Nigel said it was okay, so that's fine. So I've got, this is my second question, but it's kind of in two parts, please forgive me. So I wanted to firstly thank you, Professor, for all of your answers so far, writing scrupulous notes. The first question was just to get your thoughts. You spoke about this increasing intermesticity, I guess. And I wanted to know if your thoughts about whether this is a backlash against sort of global citizenship theory and the idea that there is a, kind of one idea about modernity, and that global citizenship theory is in fact pushing that single westernized idea about modernity. And what we're seeing with the increasing intermesticity is the relegation of the global to the local, essentially. And then within Dudley's thoughts, so within Mr. Thomas's thoughts, does he talk about the downsides of Pan-Africanism? Does he anticipate at all that you could have this sort of backlash that we're seeing when we're talking about globalization and global citizenship theory, that you could also have a backlash against Pan-African identity, which you kind of alluded to at the beginnings of the interactions? So that's the first thing I wanted to ask about. The second thing I wanted to ask about was the idea of political Blackness and whether this appears within Thomas's thoughts at all. And the reason I want to ask this is because you mentioned that though he made an attempt to sort of rehabilitate Garvey, he is distinguished from Garvey because of his, I guess you say he's not as radical, which I guess would probably mean not only in the means that he proposed, but perhaps some of his racial theories about racial purity, things like that, perhaps, I'm not sure. And I wanted to know how he dealt with the multiplicity of Caribbean identity, and particularly, and also in Tanzania, I'm gonna say Tanzania, because that's easier for me to say as well, the multiplicity of African identity in that particular part of the world, and whether he spoke at all about sort of political Blackness. Could other people that were not of African heritage enter into political Blackness? And how did that manifest in the Caribbean and in Tanzania in his writings, if he spoke about it at all? Thank you.
Okay, and Nigel has a question also for you.
Yeah, so I wondered if you can also weaving something you said about us trying to change the international global world order. And you said that we'd already tried that. And I wanted to know when that was, and what happened, like who were the players and who was influential in, bringing about that shift. And also as well, I'm thinking about his relationship with Manley, because a couple of years ago, I watched this movie called Life and Debt. It was talking about the neo-colonial relations between the Bretton Woods institutions and Jamaica, and how that relationship was killing the economy of Jamaica. And so I want to know, like, what was his kind of, I guess, advice to Manley around that? How much influence did he have on Manley? And how much did Manley take from him in the conversations, in the dealings that he had with the IMF and the World Bank and the Washington Consensus generally?
Terrific.
Okay, so if we go with those 3 questions, if that's all right.
Okay, that's good. I will try to take those on. The first, I will start with Mr. Dukaran, and I'm delighted to have Mr. Dukaran in the audience because I've had the opportunity of working with him when I was director of the Institute of International Relations in Trinidad. So he was foreign minister at the time, and because as foreign minister, he was able to encourage the cabinet of Trinidad and Tobago to support the idea of a diplomatic school to train diplomats in the Caribbean. So I know Winston knows my predilection for diplomacy. And I think this is one of the things that I've sort of stressed. I saw it as well in Dudley's work, Dudley Thompson's work, this emphasis on diplomacy, which is I think very important, especially in the world in which we live today. But Winston, thank you very much for your question. I think this idea of international order, international justice systems is important. We've seen just recently the stress that has been placed on the responsibility to protect individuals. The RTP principle that's been around the year 2000 was elevated to the United Nations system, was actually passed by all members of the United Nations system as a new, I should say, a new principle of international justice, that individuals who were being not protected, who were not protected by the nation state sovereignty, therefore ought to be protected by some other form, namely the international community should step in whenever individual nation state leaders refuse to protect their own people. And from major crimes like crimes against humanity, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and the like. I think, personally speaking, that you can place slavery under that category of crimes against humanity. It has all of the elements of international crime against humanity, and therefore an international justice system aimed towards reparation for the injustices that were done to African slaves and their descendants, I think is very much in order. But given the fact that we have difficulties in trying to determine how individuals can be compensated for those crimes, I believe that we have a moral responsibility to look at other ways of compensation and to use the development as a case study here. I'm just thinking about St. Vincent, who just went through that major volcano in the north, which caused, the movement of people away from that area for a while. I think about Dominica, who went through a major earthquake, and I think about major hurricanes that happened in the Caribbean. There are so many ways in which the small states of the globe are experiencing vulnerabilities, manifold vulnerabilities from all of these different problems, including climate change. And I think the time has come to think in terms of how do we help them to overcome their problems of major setback in development, sometimes 20 years, 30 years of setbacks in their developmental progress. Having to take money that should normally be used for social development, for healthcare systems, and then put it into rehabilitation reconstruction of the country after a major hurricane or major earthquake or major volcano. So I think we can create a model based on development, a model of reparations based on development, based on aiding countries, not necessarily financial aid, but based on trying to help countries that have been hard hit by these vulnerabilities to get back on their feet again. So this could be one model in which we can utilize the reparations. So I hope that answers your question, Winston, but we can have a conversation about that as well. But this idea of a human justice system that's based on protecting the individual from all these vulnerabilities, I think is very important. Apika, thanks very much for your questions as well. I like your use of intermesticity because I think that there is a notion of this blurring of the lines between the domestic and the international, which has come about as a result largely of the speed in which globalization has changed things for people. We can no longer think that just because there is an outbreak of COVID-19 in one part of the world, that's not going to happen to us. I mean, we know now that these pandemics can affect every corner of the globe almost instantaneously because of our habits of travel, etc. We know that we are as affected by terrorism in some parts of the world as in other parts. I think about Trinidad and Tobago, since Mr. Dukaran is from there. There were quite a number of Trinidadians who left Trinidad to go fight on behalf of ISIS in Syria. I mean, how much more international can you get? How much more intermestic can you get, I should say? This is a problem that we have to think about in terms of changing our way of thinking about how the world ought to be governed, right? National governance may not always work. Sometimes you have to go beneath the national state in order to be able to govern effectively. Sometimes you have to go above the national state in order to be able to govern effectively. So it causes us to think about new forms of governance. And this is one of the areas in which I'm going to be trying to undertake some work in the next little while as I undertake a term, a year, I guess, at Yale University. I'll be able to think about these issues a little bit more. Since I recently got a Fulbright to go to Yale for 1 year. And I want to think about those questions a little bit more seriously for my own research purposes. But I do think that there's a need to rethink the intermesticity of governance. I'd like to bring in subsidiarity as a principle of governance, but a bottom-up form of subsidiarity as opposed to a top-down form of subsidiarity that gives a lot of credit and a power to the local people. I think you mentioned the local to the global, right? The local people ought to be responsible for the initiatives that affect them, because they're mostly affected by these vulnerabilities that we talked about. In terms of the downsides of Pan-Africanism, I think that Dudley Thompson understood the downsides of Pan-Africanism. I think he understood that there was a division, a realistic division between the ways in which people in the Caribbean, for example, are Caribbean people who live in the UK think about themselves, and the way in which the continental Africans think about themselves. He was not fooled into believing that somehow there was a come by a moment where everybody's going to sort of get along. There are some divisions, and the divisions are real. I think Professor Ade also pointed that out as well. We cannot ignore those divisions between the Caribbean and Africa. But like Ade is doing, and like people like Hilary Beckles are doing, they're trying to sort of bridge that gap, bridge that fundamental gap. And a lot of it has to do with the kind of Eurocentric educational system that we have been forced to adopt. We have to move away from that and try to understand each other a lot better. And I think this is one of the things that Dudley Thompson was quite good in doing, simply because he had that lived experience in Africa. and then the practical experience of working as a lawyer and a politician and a diplomat in Jamaica and in the Caribbean. The notion of political blackness, I have, he hasn't said this deliberately, and I can't think of it being expressed in any of his writings in a sort of a clear manner. But, given where he grew up in Westmoreland, I don't know if you've ever been to Westmoreland, but there are people of different races in Westmoreland. He grew up in a kind of a cosmopolitan type society in Jamaica, where East Indian people got married to Black people from Africa, and therefore you had your mixed races, I guess, in that part of Jamaica. So he understands that the issue of Blackness and whiteness in many cases is quite artificial. He understood that this was more ideological than it was real. There are a lot of people in the Caribbean who have relatives from the so-called motherland from the UK. I'm partly the descendant of some Irish person who ended up, having kids from an African woman, and we are byproducts of that. So it's very difficult sometimes to make those kind of clear-cut issues about political blackness with a person like Dudley Thompson. He understood the nuances that could occur. We know for a fact in the Caribbean the kind of gradations of color which allow people with lighter skin to get certain jobs over people with a darker skin. I can still remember as a kid in Barbados that in the banking system, all the tellers were light-skinned, not necessarily white, but of lighter complexion. And that was important for the banking system for some reason. Now that's changed a lot now, but it still has been a problem in the past, this notion of the gradations of color. So this notion of a kind of a hard and fast political blackness may not actually appeal to him, to Dudley Thompson, and it wasn't part of his work. But he did understand the multiplicity of Caribbean identities. We talk about slavery and the recompense that should be made to slaves, but there were also East Indian people that were indentured servants that were treated just as badly in some cases as the Black slaves that worked for free. So, we have to take in consideration the Caribbean people as having these multiple identities. We have as much of a link to India as we have to Africa. So that sort of makes us a little bit different than people who are continental Africans, for example. We have links to Europe, to Ireland, and to in some cases, we think about Martinique and Guadeloupe, to France. So we are multiple identity populations in the Caribbean as well. So, and of course, many of those individuals went to the UK for a better life, or went somewhere else for a better life. So it becomes a little bit more complicated than simply looking at this from a strict issue of political blackness. In terms of Nigel's question on international global world order, in the 1970s, of course, there was the new international economic order that was proposed primarily by the Group of 77. And as you know, the Group of 77 was headed by China. China was the leader of the Group of 77. But this notion that the international system, the economic system, which was really the Bretton Woods, you talk about Bretton Woods, the Bretton Woods economic system, the Washington Consensus economic system, that's produced the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development and so on. That system has been largely not very good for many developing countries. And I think this is one of the reasons why the Belt and Road Initiative by China has been so important today, because many African countries actually look at China now to get some of the advantages that they would normally expect to get from the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank. So international global order obviously has to be changed it's like a decision frozen in time, 1945 time, where the Bretton Woods institution still reigns, but it's losing the impact today. Countries are now finding alternatives to the IMF, alternatives to the Bretton Woods institution. And even during Dudley Thompson's time in Jamaica, I'm sure, I don't have the evidence with me right now, but I'm sure that there were many discussions with Michael Manley about ways in which Jamaica can make a contribution to the changes in international economic order, because Jamaica did support the NIEO very much at the United Nations system, and wherever these discussions came up, you know, they was always supported very heavily by Jamaica. Jamaica supported Cuba when the United States decided to derail Cuba's economy. Jamaica was always standing by Cuba during that period of time. So I think, to be quite honest, Dudley Thompson have cemented himself as being a champion of this notion of transformation of the international economic order. And I think we need to give him a little bit more credit for that work, even although the success may not be evident of all the work that he put in, but at least he's got the ball rolling. At least he got us on a normative path towards this new international idea of a new international economic order. And I still think that that's the kind of order that we need for today's society as well. Did I answer everyone?
Yes, yes. Thank you once more, Professor. Do believe it's time for us to wrap up now, but again, we're so grateful for what you've shared. Before everybody hops off, I'd like to remind you that the next lecture in the series will be on the 14th of July with Professor Lee Daniels from the USA, who will be talking to us about the one and only El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, better known as Malcolm X, the Pan-African Prophet. We want to also encourage you to become a member of the Centre so that you can access more events and lectures of this sort. Tomorrow, we actually have a series starting on science and race. That series looks at race and racism from an evolutionary perspective. Then we also have African cosmology and many more events in the pipeline to come. Membership starts at £40 a year for students and £129 for individuals. So once again, don't forget to purchase the book if you haven't done so already. We have posted the link again in the chat. I hope the session has inspired and intellectually edified you as much as it has done me. So good night, everybody. Thank you, Professor. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and we'll see you on the 14th of July.